So the nature of animated reboots has gotten really contentious over the course of the 2010s. We've taken aim at dozens of reimagined, revived, and redone franchises. Some have helped shape how we discuss reboots on the internet indefinitely. Plenty of animation spheres ushered in the new decade by throwing out opinions on the long-anticipated reimagining Thundercats Roar and the likes of Scoob. While I've sufficiently thrown my hat into the ring on both topics, I myself had discovered a much less volatile point of discussion approximately 2 years back. Indeed, perhaps the last character you'd think to fight for in terms of revival status is perhaps the biggest and reddest of them all. December of 2019 ushered in the return of Clifford by giving him a brand spanking new, puppet-rigged, lighter, softer... Wait. You didn't know there was another Clifford cartoon? Well, there's actually 3 of them. Each of them were made in different eras and time with different creative teams, and every time Clifford got more popular, the next one incorporates elements from the previous. The Big Red Bastion has always been associated with reading and literacy skills, but you never really see how that link came to be. Well, that's what we're here to look at today, to crown the Kino Clifford of cartoon consciousness. This is the Clifford Cartoon Continuity Comparison. Starting off strong, we must pay homage to the OG Clifford tune, the 1988 VHS miniseries unofficially known as the Clifford's Fun series. Now, many wouldn't give this one a second thought, considering the scope of the project and the fact that it wasn't even a TV production. And to that I say, the production wouldn't bring together Scholastic Nelvana, the 2 main titans behind Peanuts animated classics, among others, if it wasn't worth scoping out in some capacity. Also, if I didn't look at this one, I'd have to turn to the live-action stuff. You don't want to turn to the live-action stuff. Yeah. This Clifford miniseries is arguably the standard bearer of wider Clifford merchandising. Up to that point, Clifford had a massive footprint in children's literature and has had a sizable audience since its 1963 debut. Despite that, nobody had tried to adapt him into different mediums yet. By the time this thing went into production, we were edging on 24 Clifford books. I'm sure it would have been thought of before, but it was only around the time that this product and that live-action special came along did we start to see the makings of a true kids franchise form. Hell, the ads for the series on the VHS read as extensive 4-kid pitches rather than an ad for some fun little video series. Marketing clearly had their shit together, but the rest of the production seemed a bit charmingly amateur. Boy, does the series really categorize true beginnings. The series itself seems to be a pretty low-budget undertaking. It was entrusted to some talented groupings who then had very recent and potent experience in the animation industry, and accordingly, its educational staff was similarly qualified. It's just had the final product came out looking like it was made on a Scooby-Doo budget. I guess the true beauty comes from its insular successes rather than how the show appears. It definitely doesn't look bad, especially considering the circumstances. Let's start with the basics. Every time you tune in to watch an episode, you're greeted with this bomb-ass intro.
Here comes Clifford, everyone loves Clifford, the biggest, reddest dog in history.
I love the energy it channels, and the visuals complement it surprisingly well. I feel like I walked into some 80s anime dub. It's friggin' awesome. Just 90 seconds of pure goodness. Soak it in, because you're not going to get anything like it from this point onward. Anyway, by that time passes, we get an episode title and the setup for the episode. You'll notice by this point, the art style, again, pretty interesting. The designers clearly took heavy inspiration from the source material, which is great. Generally, while they kept an illustrative feel to the shows, it feels like everything is streamlined for the animation process, mainly Clifford himself. He certainly looks more like a bouncy hound dog than anything else. They took some of his features to a very literal place. Like cartoon dogs typically have the 3 front digits and maybe a dew claw if the character designer's feeling fancy that day, but if not that, the hand is rounded out by a thumb. Clifford just has 3 fingers and they chose to spread that out in the outline of a regular cartoon hand, except since he only has 3 digits, he has alien paws. He's sporting that Barney look before he even existed. I can't stop looking at it. It's just so distracting. His proportions are fine, but a lot of his expressions are a bit awkward. In contrast, Emily's face is pretty limited. She gets the point across, sure, but at times she's channeling her inner elf on a shelf. But you know what helps diffuse awkward stilted animation? Orchestration. The music design is pretty basic here. Like I said, it's nothing like the intro. Not exactly a 180, but it's quite unlike what you thought we were getting. The whole score is just weirdly peppy synth music, the bane of any real anime dub's existence. They recycle the same few cues and tracks so much over 6 episodes, I felt like they ran out of shit to reuse. The amount of times you catch them feed that same track and really adds up. Something else that draws attention is the voice work. Yes, this is definitely not what we're used to. This seems like a pretty limited cast from Toronto doing the heavy lifting here. A lot of them, like Clifford's voice, are assorted small fries from the 80s acting sphere. Most of the cast isn't credited, but when they stick out, you'd likely recognize some of them. There's more than a few names I took stock in seeing, but with names like Tara Strong and Tabitha St. Germain, how could you miss out? Emily Elizabeth in particular is voiced by Alison Cord, who would be most prominently known by we honorary 90s kids as Lunette the Clown from The Big Comfy Couch. Cord was a child actress before her time in big top show business, and her training shows. Her betrayal straddles the border of overacting, but it doesn't fail to be engaging. Clifford, on the other hand, it's a little bit much. He's got a much goofier sound going on. I think the attempt was to give him a more dog-type voice, but it made him sound like a dope. It seemed like a very intentional choice, but one that had a debatable amount of workshopping attached to it. If you ask me, I'd say it helped contribute to the main vibe of the VHS series. Now obviously this collection is dedicated to teaching some very basic educational concepts like letters, numbers, and shapes. Since Emily's 8 and Clifford's a dog, they're basically learning along with the audience. The programs themselves tell a linear story in their world related to the topic, then interject 2 songs in the middle, and towards the end, to reinforce said concept. The shows themselves move at a snail's pace and make sure not to alienate the audience. Outside of these bits, the writing is fairly stiff. There's not much in the way of comedic content to highlight. At times it feels like it was actually written like an anime dub, which may not be too far off from the truth. Seeing how this one works to translate the academic concepts into the view of a little kid, and maybe even pressure from Scholastic to have it stay that way, the plot structure is usually pretty tight. There's just one tape called Clifford's Fun with Sounds that goes off the rails in comparison. Basically, the level of auditory education this one delivers begins and ends with matching up animal sounds with the right animals. Clifford turns out to be the next Frank Welker in disguise, which is pointed out by a talent scout. So this guy whisks him off to Hollywood to very inefficiently utilize his 25-foot dog as a living soundboard. Surprisingly, in spite of the Hollywood system, he manages to be taken care of very well, but he goes back home to stay with his family in the end. Yet he's just allowed to abandon everything he's barely worked to set up just to be with his family. Generally, the Clifford's Fun series is a pretty under-budget but fairly solid first adaptation in the Clifford canon. Its priorities were clear, and while it's not the easiest cartoon to vibe with casually, it has a lot of charm, which may win over plenty of people once they get past these slow-as-molasses educational segments. That said, it clearly had a bit of an impact on the next entry, that other show that we actually all care about. Clifford 2000 is what many would consider to be the definitive Clifford cartoon. Complete with its own movie and spin-off, it had a very sizable chunk of the PBS audience's carry over to support its own expansion of the, at that point, 40-plus-year-old franchise. Of course, it's a nostalgic favorite for many of us, and even today, it's fondly remembered. But how does it hold up? Well, for one, the art style has been significantly rounded out. Someone clearly gave Clifford the Project Runway moment because his new fall look is fun, fresh, and ready to own the catwalk. Obviously, compared to the VHS series, the art is softer, rounder, significantly proofed to be much more animation-friendly, even in comparison to the previous model. Clifford is covered from virtually every angle, and all the characters he meets fit into his artistic milieu. This may seem like a dramatic change, but if you squint at the timeline, you may notice that the art style of the original books did start to soften up over time, so it makes sense that the production would be rounded out a bit more to accommodate that. At this point, as the show took off, this art style became the dominant form of representation for Clifford. Outside of the older books, many of the newer ones were spun off directly from the show. It was a very successful rebrand. It gave Clifford's world a lot of dimensionality in a cuter package, which would help bring his adventures to life. The show itself takes a new relaxed approach to its curriculum. The focus is still reading and such, but the crux of each story was a neat little morality tale, mainly centered around Clifford and friends learning how to be good people and such. The show itself was sweet without being saccharine. It was soft enough to reach little kids, but the plots themselves held up as interesting material for grade schoolers as well. They didn't make the mistake of making everything too agreeable or making everyone a complete pushover, especially Clifford himself. In fact, I'd wager some of the most prominent characters are those who weren't of perfect temperament. This is part and parcel reliant on the vocal performances. Now, I think this is arguably the hardest part of cementing this show. The ethos of Clifford the Big Red Dog isn't terribly abstract, but there are so many takes that you could run with. The challenge was to not only have it be compatible with the future audience member, but also fit with the art style and other elements like the music. Clifford was given a level of humanity I think is underestimated. John Ritter low-key gave this dog man a soul. The way the character exudes fun and outward dog-like personality while also being able to scale back and be sensitive or maybe even a bit vulnerable was a slam dunk. Many characters were able to be funny, many others were able to be sincere, some of them could do both, but the Big Red one was undeniably the full package. The show itself was mostly grounded in semi-realism. Sometimes a pop star would get to the island or Clifford would fill in at the local circus, but save for a few vivid fantasy sequences, it was fairly down to earth. In between the two 11-minute Clifford stories, they'd wedge some shorts of an in-universe book character being read to the audience. Honestly, Speckle's stories were a highlight in and of themselves. At the end of the second segment, they had these 30-second PSAs that would leave some extra nuggets of wisdom. Though the educational aspects perhaps weren't as blunt as they were before, the pro-social elements, at least, were taken very seriously. It's no surprise to me that this version of the character has been as enduring as it is. Even after the latest entry drop, PBS affiliates around the country still air and promote this version of the character. It became even more of a merchandising vehicle, it became one of their legacy programs, and generally, it's smiled upon quite fondly. It's aged quite well, and there are no bones about it. While not as immaculate as the mainline series, the movie and the spin-off were also fairly endearing. It's no secret that the show is as popular as it is. If the voice of the main character hadn't passed so suddenly, there would have undoubtedly been more done with Clifford Mach 2. So it's likely that the pressure's been on to reinvent the character for a while, which brings us up to present day. Finally, the newest and most mysterious addition to the Clifford cartoon collection. Following in vein of its predecessors, the new series, co-produced between PBS and Amazon Studios, revives Clifford to go over reading skills and social development once more. After a Prime featured bomb drop December 2019, PBS got to air his new adventures weekly up to today. Sometimes this and previous series are aired in tandem, while some local stations may pick one over the other. New Clifford is having new adventures with new friends in familiar settings. Not many have sunk their teeth into this one, perhaps out of disinterest or fear of encroaching mediocrity. I wanted to give it a fair shake, though it would be remiss to excuse my own reservations of it. For one, we have to take a beat to acknowledge the art style they chose for this one. While not a direct hit, it's miles closer to the original Birdwell illustrations than the others, likely because the technology today can accommodate the clunkier asymmetric style. It's unfavorably drawn comparisons to another PBS cartoon, Peg Plus Cat, of which it shares a producer and an animation studio with the reboot. Of course, Clifford's escapades are puppet rigged now, and as are the rest of the PBS Kids slate. The big man himself is the most notable mark of the beast, as the human characters are cleaned up visually from the days of old. Emily Elizabeth looks like she jumped straight out of that other show rather than her own source material. With variable subtlety, they established this as a lighter, softer reboot. You know what could have tipped you off if not for the art? The songs. God damn the songs. There is an abundance of music in this one. The last series definitely had some room for music, but not very much. This is as musical as it gets for a modern kids show. Presumably every member of the voice cast was selected for some modicum of musical ability. Clifford and Emily Elizabeth had to be on point because they belt out a tune every single episode. On surface level, this may seem a bit jarring for whoever's carried over from the previous eras. Of course, we know it's not an absurdity for a show of its ilk. It's simply just a different vibe, and here, they don't miss any opportunities to break out their inner Broadway. The songs themselves are pretty self-indulgent, but there is enough diversity to their execution that should at least not put you to sleep. It's one aspect of the show that perhaps now overemphasizes the pro-social elements in the new reboot. The earlier stuff was certainly a bit soft and sweet, but there was no room for the show to grow without some form of conflict. Birdwell Island without a Jeddah or a Mac or a Mr. Bleakman was a very, very grim prospect. The characters and personalities featured here lovingly throw that out the window in favor of a more introspective look into each character. It makes Birdwell Island feel more saccharine than in years past. The big red dog's image was lightened a bit. The voice actor chosen to portray him gave him a much higher register, a softer heart, and an atrocious bark. A lot of the characters from the 2000 series seem to have been reincarnated into these newer, flatter characters. They're reminiscent, but not quite scratching the itch. Even the nature of what dogs they picked to shadow Clifford felt like a bit of a riff on Cleo and T-Bone. The interstitials are something different, but at times they may feel like they're aiming to fill that speckle-sized hole in our hearts. It's disconcerting how similar this cast is to the previous, and yet it feels like the simulation messed up 80% of the way through. What's especially striking is how Clifford himself is impacted. The dominant force of the big man on campus is that he is a kind and gentle temperament, manning the size and strength of many giants. He's supposed to be a bit soft and introspective, but he is still mainly an occasionally goofy, fun-loving dog. I think each series handles him a little bit differently, but bias aside, the 2000 series might have hit the right balance. Being able to give him a sensitive personality while still planting him firmly on four legs was what made him so effective as not only a voice of reason, but also a teaching tool. Despite his size, he could stand at eye level with the audience and run through their emotions. He's not perfect, but he is slowly learning, adapting, growing through these escapades as far more than just a dog. While new Clifford is obviously still an empathetic and kind creature, he is perhaps leaning too much into the role of the audience. He's much more vulnerable, which is not bad in and of itself, but the more personable elements, such as the current mind meld with Emily Elizabeth, makes him much less of an anchor for the show. How can I put this delicately? He's functioning at a Super Weenie Hut Jr., and I need him to be at a Weenie Hut General. You know what I mean? Now that he takes on the same role as the audience, it kind of deadens the effect. There's a bit of a line between a character that kids can identify with and one that basically is one of them. Though its devotion to charting socio-emotional development is admirable, it may come at the detriment of the storytelling goals itself. This observation mainly occurred to me after screening a Halloween episode of the new cartoon, which featured Clifford, Emily, and a few of her friends. One of her friends was wearing a monster mask, and it really freaked Clifford out to the point where he's just screaming and yelping and, just generally being a nuisance. Now, I think the original show would probably have some form of take on this too. I mean, Clifford was definitely spooked by things that were smaller than him, obviously, but the pure terror in New Clifford was just astounding to me. I felt like I was in the Twilight Zone. And these might be peak boomer opinions, but to me it felt like it was coming at a major conflict of who the character is, what he's supposed to accomplish. It's a very strange episode, to say the least. Granted, New Clifford definitely left a lot of room for them to explore the semiotics of the character. In this show, Emily Elizabeth and Clifford talk freely amongst themselves when not in the presence of others. They sing songs, tell stories, and talk about their troubles. They don't really explain it or anything, especially since it's not challenged by anyone else. It's the only crosstalk we observe between the dogs and their humans. Overall, New Clifford tries hard to satisfy the bar raised by the previous entry, and it's really easy to criticize it for its creative choices. But it's also easy to see what kids of current year would enjoy about it. I tried to be open-minded when watching it because right when it came out, I was far from impressed with the final product. Even now, I don't think I'd clamor to watch it, nostalgic bias at all. All the same, it has enough of it to encapsulate a lot of what makes Clifford such a based literary protagonist. So you're probably wondering which Clifford may reign supreme. Would it be Vintage Clifford, Default Clifford, or Reboot Clifford? The truth is, there cannot only be one. Each Clifford probably suits their time period best, even if some are more endearing than others. There's undoubtedly someone out there that was impacted positively by any of the three. That's the whole point of the character, right? It's easier to unite and consolidate rather than divide and conquer. We all need to stand together and recognize each other's accomplishments. And collectively shit on this new movie. I mean, what is this? What is this?
Clifford, no fetch! Clifford!